I was working the night shift at a 24-hour pharmacy in suburban New Jersey. It was just past 2 a.m., and I was restocking shelves under the buzz of fluorescent lights. The night had been quiet, as usual, with only a few customers coming in for late-night essentials. While I was arranging boxes of cold medicine, the door chimed. A man stumbled in, his eyes darting around the store. He was drenched in sweat, his t-shirt clinging to his body despite the cool air conditioning. Something about him immediately put me on edge. He approached the counter, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface. Without making eye contact, he asked for syringes in a low, urgent voice. I nodded and turned to retrieve them from behind the counter. As I searched for the right package, I could hear him shifting his weight from foot to foot, breathing heavily and irregularly. When I glanced back, I saw him repeatedly looking out the large front windows, as if expecting someone to appear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't our usual late-night crowd. Most people coming in at this hour were bleary-eyed shift workers or parents with sick kids. This guy was different. He radiated nervous energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I found the syringes and slowly made my way back to the counter. The man's eyes were now fixed on the door, his whole body tense. I placed the package on the counter, and he reached for it with shaking hands. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was shattered by the sound of sirens. 2 police cars came speeding down the street, their lights painting the store in flashes of red and blue. The man's eyes went wide with panic. In an instant, everything changed. The man vaulted over the counter, knocking over a display of vitamins. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. He was right there, invading my space, his frantic eyes locked onto mine. The man frantically whispered that I needed to help him, and that they couldn't find him here. I was frozen in place, trapped between the wall of medications and this unstable stranger. The sirens grew louder, and I could see the police cars pulling into the parking lot through the store windows. The man pressed himself against me, trying to make himself as small as possible behind the counter. I could smell the sour scent of his sweat and feel the heat radiating off his body. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I'd never felt so vulnerable in my life. The police car doors slammed shut outside. I heard voices and the sound of boots on pavement. The man's breathing was ragged in my ear, his body trembling against mine. I was acutely aware of how close we were to the pharmacy's stock of controlled substances. What if he was after those? What if he had a weapon? The store's bell chimed again as the door opened. I heard a deep voice announce the police presence and ask if anyone was there. I opened my mouth to respond, but the man clamped his hand over it, his fingers digging into my cheeks. His other arm wrapped around me, holding me in place. I could feel his rapid heartbeat against my back. Footsteps approached the counter. I tried to make a sound, to move, to do anything, but fear had paralyzed me. The man's grip tightened, and I realized with horror that I was now essentially his hostage. The officer called out again, closer now, asking for pharmacy staff. I heard the rustle of fabric and the creak of leather. The officer was leaning over the counter, about to see us. The man tensed, ready to spring into action. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was about to happen. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows. In that moment, I wasn't a pharmacy technician anymore. I was just a person trapped in a nightmare, praying to wake up. But this was real, all too real. The officer's flashlight beam swept across the floor behind the counter, inching closer to our hiding spot. I could feel the man's fingernails digging into my arm, his breath hot on my neck. The beam of light crept closer, illuminating our shoes. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Each second felt like an eternity as I waited for the inevitable moment of discovery. The tension in the air was so thick I could barely breathe. My entire world had narrowed down to this small space behind the counter, the erratic breathing of the man holding me, and the ever-approaching beam of the officer's flashlight. I thought about my family, my friends, all the normal things I'd been doing just hours ago. How had my ordinary night shift turned into this terrifying ordeal? The contrast between the mundane task of restocking shelves and the current life-threatening situation was jarring. The light inched up our legs. Any moment now, the officer would see us. I braced myself for whatever would happen next. Would the man try to use me as a shield? Would he surrender? Or would this situation escalate into something even more dangerous? Just then, a crackling sound broke the tense silence. It was the officer's radio. I couldn't make out the exact words, but it seemed there was another situation elsewhere that required attention. The flashlight beam suddenly swung away. The officer responded to the radio call, and I heard footsteps retreating quickly. The bell chimed again as the door opened and closed. Car engines roared to life, and the sound of sirens faded into the distance. For a moment, neither the man nor I moved. We stood there, frozen in disbelief at the sudden turn of events. Then, all at once, he released me and bolted for the door. I stumbled forward, gasping for air, my legs weak. I heard the bell chime one last time as the man disappeared into the night, leaving me alone in the suddenly quiet store. I slumped against the counter, my whole body shaking. The familiar surroundings of the pharmacy now seemed alien and threatening. Every shadow held potential danger. The night that had started so ordinarily had turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. As I stood there trying to process what had just happened, I realized that my sense of safety, especially during these night shifts, had been shattered. The mundane task of working at a 24-hour pharmacy would never feel the same again. The events of that night would stay with me, a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary situation can turn into a nightmare. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. The campus was dead quiet that night. I was doing my usual security rounds at this small college in Vermont. It was the middle of winter and the cold was biting. The old buildings looked almost ghostly under the dim streetlights, their windows dark and empty. I'd been working this night shift for a few months now. It was usually pretty uneventful, just me, my flashlight, and the occasional raccoon digging through trash cans. I'd walk around, check doors, make sure nothing was out of place. Most nights I didn't see a single person. I was about halfway through my rounds when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it sounded more like someone crying. It was faint, but definitely there. I stopped walking and tried to figure out where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from one of the old academic buildings. It was a big, stone structure that had been there since the college was founded. During the day it was full of students and professors. At night it was supposed to be empty. I headed towards the building, my boots crunching on the frozen grass. As I got closer, the crying got louder. It was definitely coming from inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why would anyone be in there at this hour? The front door was locked as it should be. I used my key to open it, and the heavy door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it was pitch black. I switched on my flashlight and swept it across the entrance hall. The beam caught dust particles floating in the air and cast long shadows on the walls. The crying echoed through the empty hallways. It sounded desperate, almost painful. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. With each step, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up a little more. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the sound seemed to be coming from. Up here, the classrooms were lined up on either side of a long corridor. Most of the doors were closed, but one was slightly ajar. The crying was definitely coming from in there. I approached the door slowly, my hand resting on the radio at my hip. I should have called for backup, but something made me hesitate. Maybe I thought I could handle it on my own, or maybe I was just curious. Either way, I decided to check it out first. I pushed the door open wider with my foot, shining my flashlight into the room. At first, I didn't see anything. It was just an ordinary classroom, desks, chairs, a whiteboard at the front. But then my light caught movement in the corner. There was someone huddled on the floor, their back to me. It looked like a student, young with long hair. They were rocking back and forth, making those awful crying sounds I'd been hearing. I called out, asking if they were okay. The person didn't respond, just kept rocking and crying. I took a step into the room, then another. I was trying to be careful, to not startle them. But with each step, I felt more and more uneasy. When I was about halfway across the room, the crying suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more unsettling. I froze, my flashlight beam fixed on the person's back. Then, in one sudden movement, they whirled around to face me. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw their face. It was tear-stained and contorted in a way that didn't look quite right. Their eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around the room before locking onto me. Before I could react, they lunged forward. That's when I saw the glint of metal in their hand. They were holding a pair of scissors, the blades open and pointed right at me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The student, I could see now it was a young woman, was coming at me fast. She swung the scissors wildly, barely missing my arm. I managed to dodge to the side, bumping into a desk. The noise seemed to agitate her more. She let out a scream that didn't sound human and came at me again. This time I wasn't quick enough. I felt a sharp pain as the scissors grazed my forearm. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to make me realize how much danger I was in. This wasn't just a distressed student. This was someone who was trying to hurt me. I grabbed a chair and held it in front of me like a shield. She stabbed at it with the scissors, the metal making a horrible screeching sound against the plastic seat. I used the moment to back up towards the door, but she was between me and the exit. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't hurt her. She was just a student, probably having some kind of breakdown. But I also couldn't let her stab me. I needed to restrain her somehow. She lunged again, and this time I was ready. I dropped the chair and grabbed her wrist as she swung the scissors at me. We struggled, and I could feel how strong she was. It took all my strength to keep that sharp blade away from my face. With my free hand, I managed to grab my radio. I called for backup, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. The woman was screaming now, trying to wrench her arm free. I held on tight, knowing that if I let go, those scissors would be coming right for me. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a few minutes before I heard the sound of running footsteps in the hallway. 2 other security guards burst into the room. With their help, we managed to disarm the woman and restrain her. As we held her down, waiting for the police and ambulance to arrive, I finally had a moment to process what had just happened. My arm was stinging where the scissors had cut me, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The woman had stopped struggling and was now sobbing quietly. I looked at the scissors on the floor, their blades reflecting the beam of my dropped flashlight. They were ordinary classroom scissors, the kind you'd find in any school supply store. But in that moment, they looked as dangerous as any weapon I'd ever seen. The police arrived, followed closely by an ambulance. As they took over the situation, I found myself standing in the hallway, leaning against the wall. My legs felt weak, and I was suddenly aware of how cold I was. One of the other guards asked if I was okay, and I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I watched the paramedics lead the woman away, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to being seriously hurt, or worse. What had started as a routine night shift had turned into the most terrifying experience of my life, and as I stood there in that empty hallway, I realized that my job and my life would never feel quite the same again. I work nights at this diner off the highway in Nebraska. It's one of those 24-hour places where truckers and night owls stop for coffee and food. Most nights are pretty quiet, just me and the cook in the back. This one night was dead slow. I'd been there for hours and only had a couple customers. I was wiping down the counter again when the door opened. 4 people walked in, 2 guys and 2 women. They looked rough, like they hadn't slept in days. Their clothes were all wrinkled and they kept looking around like they were expecting trouble. They sat in a booth at the back, far from the windows. I grabbed some menus and went over. As I got closer, I could see how on edge they were. One guy was tapping his fingers nonstop and one of the women kept messing with her hair. I asked if they wanted drinks, and they all mumbled, "coffee," in these really quiet voices. While I was pouring, I noticed they'd look at the door every time a car went by on the highway. It was weird, like they were afraid someone was going to burst in at any moment. When I brought their coffee, they shut up real quick. It was like they were scared I'd hear something I shouldn't. They ordered some food, just fries and sandwiches. But the way they did it was strange. They barely said anything, like they were trying to keep their mouths shut as much as possible. For the next couple hours, they just sat there. They hardly touched their food, but kept asking for more coffee. Every time I went over, they'd stop talking. But as soon as I walked away, I could hear them whispering again. It was making me real uneasy, like I was in the middle of something I didn't understand. I tried to keep busy, but it was hard not to watch them. They were the only ones in the place, and something about them was making me real nervous. I kept thinking about all those stories of diners getting robbed. My hands were shaking a bit as I refilled the salt shakers. It was during one of these coffee refills that I heard it. I wasn't trying to listen in, but one of the guys said something about avoiding the cops. My stomach felt like it dropped to my feet. I almost spilled coffee everywhere. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. I walked back to the counter trying to act normal, but my mind was going a mile a minute. What had I gotten myself into? Were these people running from the law? I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I kept glancing at them, trying to figure out what they might be up to. I didn't know what to do. Should I say something to them? No way, that seemed way too dangerous. Should I just ignore it and hope they'd leave? But what if they were planning something worse? I felt stuck, like I was caught between a rock and a hard place. I decided to call the cops. I went to the back where the cook was on break and used the phone there. I kept my voice down, telling the dispatcher what was going on. They said they'd send someone, but it might take a while since we're pretty far out. That didn't make me feel any better. After I hung up, I had to go back out there. I felt like they'd be able to tell what I'd done just by looking at me, but they were too wrapped up in their own talk to notice anything different. Still, I felt like I was walking on eggshells every time I had to go near their table. The next hour felt like it went on forever. Every car that went by made me jump. I kept expecting to see police lights, but nothing happened. The group just kept sitting there, drinking coffee and whispering. I tried to keep myself busy cleaning things that were already clean, just to have something to do with my hands. Then, out of nowhere, they got up. One of them threw some money on the table and they all headed for the door. I watched them go, feeling relieved but also scared. What if they were leaving because they somehow knew I'd called the cops? I held my breath as they walked past me, afraid they might do something. They got into this beat-up old car in the parking lot and took off down the highway. I stood at the window, watching until I couldn't see their lights anymore. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold on to anything. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I'd done the right thing. About 10 minutes later, a cop car pulled in. An officer came in and asked me some questions. I told him everything I'd seen and heard. He took some notes and said they'd keep an eye out for the car. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late, that those people were long gone. After the cop left, I still had a few hours left in my shift. Every time I heard a car on the highway, I'd freeze up. I kept thinking that group might come back, mad that I'd called the cops on them. I found myself constantly looking at the door, expecting them to burst in at any moment. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little noise. The cook tried to ask what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just kept cleaning stuff that was already clean and checking the windows. Every shadow seemed like a threat, and every sound made me flinch. The rest of the shift dragged on. I couldn't stop thinking about those people. Who were they? What were they running from? I kept imagining all sorts of scenarios, each one worse than the last. Were they bank robbers? Escaped convicts? I had no way of knowing, and that made it even scarier. I kept an eye on the news for the next few days, half expecting to see something about a manhunt or a crime spree. But there was nothing. It was like those 4 people had just vanished into thin air. That almost made it worse, not knowing what happened to them or why they were running. Now every time I'm on shift, I can't help but wonder who might walk through that door next. Every group of customers that comes in late at night makes me a little nervous. I find myself watching them closely, looking for any signs that something might be off. That night changed the way I see my job. What used to be a quiet, easy gig now feels like it could turn dangerous at any moment. I'm more alert now, more aware of my surroundings, but I'm also more scared. Every shift feels like I'm waiting for something to happen, for those people to come back, or for someone else just like them to show up. I don't know if I'll ever feel totally safe working here again. That one night showed me how quickly things can go from normal to terrifying. It's like a veil was lifted and now I can't stop seeing the potential danger in every situation. I keep wondering if I'll ever have another night like that one, and what I'll do if I do. I work as a night nurse at this small hospital in Oregon. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone, you know? Usually night shifts are pretty quiet. We've got about 30 beds, mostly filled with the usual mix of recovering patients and a few long-term care folks. That night started like any other. I clocked in, got my assignments, and started my rounds. The halls were dim, just the way we keep them at night to let patients rest. I checked on this elderly lady first. Let's call her Mrs. J. She's always a bit restless at night. Then I moved on to the new guy who'd had his appendix out earlier that day. Everything was normal, just the quiet beeping of monitors and the soft shuffle of my shoes on the linoleum. But then, as I was heading to the nurse's station to update some charts, I noticed something odd. The lights in the hallway seemed to flicker, just for a second. I thought maybe I was seeing things. You know how your eyes can play tricks on you when you're tired. I shrugged it off and kept going, but then it happened again, this time longer. The overhead lights dimmed and brightened, like someone was messing with a giant dimmer switch. I stopped in my tracks, looking around. That's when I heard it. A low hum that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, without warning, everything went dark. And I mean pitch black. The kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. For a second, I just stood there, frozen. The silence was deafening. All those machines that usually beep and hum constantly had gone silent. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight, and the small beam of light felt pathetically inadequate in the vast darkness of the hospital hallway. That's when it hit me. The backup generator hadn't kicked in. It was supposed to start automatically in case of a power outage, but something had gone wrong. I could hear stirring from the rooms around me. Patients were waking up, confused and scared. I knew I had to act fast. I started moving down the hallway, using my phone's light to guide me. The beam bounced off the walls, creating weird shadows that made everything look unfamiliar and eerie. As I approached the first room, I could hear someone inside starting to panic. It was the appendix guy. He was calling out, his voice getting higher and more frantic by the second. I went in, trying to keep my voice calm as I explained what was happening. But inside, I was freaking out. All I could think about was all the equipment that wasn't working. The monitors, the IV pumps, everything that these people depended on. I moved from room to room, checking on patients, trying to reassure them. But with each step, the weight of the situation pressed down on me harder. These people were relying on me, on us, to keep them safe. And right now, in the dark, with no power, I felt completely helpless. The darkness seemed to amplify every sound. I could hear people shifting in their beds, whispered conversations, and even a few muffled sobs. The air felt thick and heavy, like the darkness was a physical presence pressing in on us. I made my way to the nurse's station, hoping to find someone else. Anyone else. The beam of my phone's flashlight swept across the empty desk, the blank computer screen staring back at me like dead eyes. I tried the landline phone. Nothing. No dial tone. Just dead silence. That's when I heard a crash from down the hall. My heart jumped into my throat. I spun around, my light barely cutting through the darkness. I started moving towards the sound, my feet feeling like lead with each step. As I got closer, I could hear labored breathing and a soft whimper. It was Mrs. J. She'd tried to get out of bed in the dark and fallen. I found her on the floor, tangled in her IV line. I knelt beside her, checking for injuries, all while trying to keep my light steady and my voice calm. But inside, I was screaming. What if she'd broken something? How would we even know without x-rays? How long before we could get help? I managed to help her back into bed, but the whole time, my mind was racing. What about the patients on ventilators? What about the medications that needed to be kept cold? Every second that passed felt like we were getting closer to a disaster. I decided I had to try to find the maintenance guy. He was usually around somewhere, even at night. I left Mrs. J's room, promising I'd be back soon. The hallway seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper and more menacing. I moved as fast as I dared, my light bouncing wildly as I half walked, half jogged down the corridor. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural moan coming from one of the rooms ahead. It didn't sound human. It was the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold. I slowed down, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came again, louder this time. I approached the door, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone steady. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. The beam of my light fell on the bed, and for a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It was an elderly patient with dementia. Let's call him Mr. P. But in the dark, confused and scared, he'd somehow gotten tangled in his sheets and IV lines. He was thrashing around, making those terrible sounds, completely disoriented. I rushed to him, trying to calm him down, to untangle him. But he was strong, stronger than I expected, and he was fighting me every step of the way. As I struggled with Mr. P, I could hear more commotion in the hallway. Other patients were getting agitated, calling out. The darkness seemed to be feeding their fears, making everything worse. I felt like I was trying to hold back a flood with my bare hands. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was the distinct beeping of a cardiac monitor going into alarm. Somewhere in the darkness, a patient's heart had stopped. But without power, without light, how could we even begin to help them? I ran out into the hallway, my light wildly swinging around as I tried to figure out which room the sound was coming from. The beeping seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls. I felt like I was in a nightmare, running in slow motion, never able to reach my destination. Finally, I found the right room. It was a patient recovering from heart surgery. We'll call him Mr. G. I started CPR immediately, counting compressions in my head, trying to keep rhythm in the pitch black. I yelled for help, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. I don't know how long I kept it up. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness. My arms were burning, my back aching, but I couldn't stop. Mr. G's life was literally in my hands. Then suddenly, the lights flickered back to life. The machines around me whirred and beeped as they rebooted. The cardiac monitor sprang back to life, showing a weak but steady heartbeat. Mr. G had pulled through. As quickly as it had started, it was over. The halls were flooded with light, almost painfully bright after the intense darkness. I could hear voices, footsteps, the normal sounds of the hospital coming back to life. Other nurses and doctors were rushing in, taking over, asking questions. I stood there, my scrubs soaked with sweat, my arms shaking from exertion. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and the full weight of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. We'd been through hell, but somehow, we'd made it out the other side. So I drive this night bus in Chicago. It's usually pretty chill, you know? Most nights it's just me, the road, and a handful of tired folks trying to get home. But this one night in the dead of winter, man, it turned into something straight out of a nightmare. It was cold as hell outside, the kind of night where your breath freezes the second it leaves your mouth. The streets were mostly empty, just a few cars here and there. I'd been driving for a couple hours already, picking up the occasional passenger at the stops along my route. Everything was going smooth until this guy got on at one of the downtown stops. Right away, I could tell something was off about him. He stumbled up the steps, fumbling with his change. The smell hit me before he even made it to the fare box. Booze, and lots of it. But hey, it wasn't the first drunk passenger I'd had, and I figured he'd just find a seat and pass out like most of them do. Boy, was I wrong. At first, he just mumbled to himself, swaying in his seat. I kept an eye on him in my rearview mirror, but I wasn't too worried. Then he started getting louder, saying stuff that didn't make sense. I noticed the other passengers, there were maybe 6 or 7 of them, starting to look uncomfortable. That's when things started to go south. This guy, he stands up, grabbing onto the seats to keep his balance. He starts talking to the other passengers, getting in their faces. I couldn't make out everything he was saying, but I could tell by their reactions that it wasn't pleasant. I called out to him, told him he needed to sit down. He ignored me at first, so I said it again, louder this time. That's when he turned his attention to me. He stumbled down the aisle, gripping the seats as he went. I could see his face clearly now in the rearview mirror. And let me tell you, the look in his eyes, it was wild, unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing me, you know? He got right up behind my seat, breathing heavy. I told him again, firm but calm, that he needed to sit down or I'd have to stop the bus. That's when he started yelling, calling me names, saying he wasn't going to listen to me or anyone else. I was trying to keep my cool, keep my eyes on the road, but then I felt his hand on my shoulder. He was leaning over me, his face right next to mine. The smell of booze was overwhelming. And then, out of nowhere, he grabbed for the wheel. I reacted on instinct, swerving the bus to the right onto the shoulder. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I managed to get the bus stopped without crashing, but now I had a whole new problem on my hands. We were on a stretch of road with nothing around, no buildings, no other cars, just empty lots on one side and a chain-link fence on the other. And I had a bus full of scared passengers and one very unpredictable, very angry, drunk guy. I knew I had to get the other passengers off the bus. It wasn't safe for them to be there with this guy acting the way he was. So I opened the doors and told everyone to get out, to wait on the sidewalk. They didn't need to be told twice. They were out of there in seconds, huddled together in the cold. But now it was just me and him. He was still right there, hovering over me, swaying on his feet. I tried talking to him, real calm-like, telling him we could work this out. But he wasn't having it. He started pacing up and down the aisle, shouting and swearing. I reached for my radio, called for help. Told dispatch we had a situation, needed police backup ASAP. The whole time I'm keeping one eye on this guy, worried he might lunge at me again. Those next few minutes, waiting for help to arrive, they felt like hours. The guy was getting more and more worked up. He kicked at the seats, punched the windows. I was scared he might actually break one. Then he turned to me again. He came charging down the aisle, screaming something about how I was trying to trap him. I stood up, ready to defend myself if I had to. He got right in my face, so close I could see the veins in his bloodshot eyes. For a second I thought he was going to hit me. I tensed up, ready for the blow, but then he just stopped. He stared at me for what felt like forever, swaying slightly. Then he stumbled back, fell into one of the seats. That's when I heard the sirens. I've never been so relieved to see those flashing lights in my life. 2 police cars pulled up alongside the bus. I opened the doors, and the officers came rushing in. They took control of the situation real quick. One of them got the guy in handcuffs while the other checked on me and the passengers outside. Before I knew it, they were leading him off the bus. As they put him in the back of the police car, I just stood there watching. My hands were shaking and I realized I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. The passengers were being questioned by one of the officers, all of them looking as shaken up as I felt. One of the cops came over to me, asked if I was okay to continue my route. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I really was. But what else could I do? The job had to get done. Passengers had to get home. As I watched the police cars drive away, their lights flashing in the darkness, I took a deep breath. The passengers started to file back onto the bus, quiet now, avoiding eye contact. I sat back down in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel tight. With one last look at the empty road where the police cars had disappeared, I closed the doors and pulled back onto the street, continuing my route into the night. I work the graveyard shift at this gas station out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. It's usually pretty quiet, you know? Just me, the hum of the refrigerators, and maybe a trucker or two stopping by for coffee. But this one night, man, it turned into something straight out of a nightmare. It was a slow night, even for the graveyard shift. I'd been there for a few hours already, just stocking shelves and scrolling through my phone. The weather had been acting up all day, but I didn't think much of it. We get storms out here all the time, right? But then I started noticing how the wind was picking up. It was making this weird whistling sound as it whipped around the building. I remember looking out the windows and seeing the trees bending in ways I'd never seen before. That's when I started to get this uneasy feeling in my gut. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the coffee station, but I kept glancing outside. The sky had turned this weird greenish-black color. I'd lived in Texas my whole life, but I'd never seen anything like it. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then it started raining. But this wasn't normal rain. It was coming down in sheets so heavy I could barely see the gas pumps outside. The sound of it hitting the roof was deafening. I remember thinking, maybe I should call my manager. But before I could even reach for my phone, everything went dark. The power cut out so suddenly it took me a second to realize what had happened. One moment I'm standing there in the fluorescent lights, and the next, I'm in complete darkness. The silence was eerie. All those humming machines that you don't even notice most of the time, they all went quiet at once. I fumbled for my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. My hands were shaking so bad it took me a couple tries. When I finally got it on, the beam seemed so small against all that darkness. I swept it around the store, and that's when I realized how bad things were getting. The rain was coming down so hard now that water was starting to seep in under the door. I could hear things hitting the building. Not just rain, but bigger stuff. Branches, maybe? Or worse. Each impact made me flinch. I kept thinking, what if something breaks through? And then, as if the storm had heard my thoughts, there was this almighty crash. The front door, this big glass thing, just exploded inward. Glass went flying everywhere. The wind and rain came howling in, and I swear I thought I was about to be swept away. I dropped to the floor behind the counter, trying to make myself as small as possible. The wind was so strong it was knocking stuff off the shelves. I could hear things crashing and breaking all around me, but I was too scared to look. All I could do was huddle there, my back pressed against the cold metal of the counter, listening to the chaos. The storm seemed to go on forever. Every time I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. The whole building was shaking. I kept hearing these creaking noises from above me, and all I could think was, this is it. The roof's going to cave in. I was sure I was going to die there, crushed under the rubble of a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how long I sat there, curled up in a ball, waiting for the end. Time seemed to stop making sense. Was it minutes? Hours? It felt like days. The storm just kept raging. Every now and then, there'd be a lull, and I'd think maybe it was over. But then it would come back even stronger, like it was angry we'd survived this long. At some point, I realized I was soaked through. The rain was blowing in so hard it was like being in a shower. I was shivering, but I was too scared to move. Every time the wind gusted, I could feel debris hitting me. Little pieces of who knows what that had been picked up by the storm. The worst part was the sounds. It wasn't just the wind and rain. There were these loud cracks and bangs that I couldn't identify. Was it trees falling? Parts of the building coming apart? Cars in the parking lot being tossed around? I had no idea, and my imagination was running wild with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I tried to distract myself by thinking about other things, my family, my friends, anything but the storm. But every crash and bang would jolt me back to reality. I found myself bargaining, promising I'd do anything if I just made it through this night. As the storm raged on, I started to lose hope that it would ever end. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. My phone battery was getting low, and I was terrified of being left in complete darkness. I rationed the light, only turning it on every now and then to check my surroundings. Each time I did, I saw more destruction. Shelves had toppled over, spilling their contents across the floor. The refrigerators had been forced open by the wind, and drinks were rolling around everywhere, and always, there was more water. It was ankle deep now and rising. I kept thinking about all the stories I'd heard about flash floods, about how people get swept away in their cars. What if the water kept rising? What if I drowned here in this gas station? I tried to plan what I'd do if that happened, but my mind kept going blank with panic. The storm seemed to have a life of its own. It would ease up for a moment, tricking me into thinking it was nearly over, and then come back with a vengeance. Each time it intensified, I felt my hope dwindling. How much more could this building take? How much more could I take? I lost all sense of time. My world had shrunk to the small space behind the counter, to the sound of the wind and rain, to the feeling of water slowly rising around me. I was exhausted but too terrified to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, another crash would jolt me awake. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I realized something had changed. The wind wasn't howling quite as loudly. The impacts on the building weren't as frequent. Was it really calming down, or was this just another lull before it got worse again? I stayed where I was, afraid to hope. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the storm really was subsiding. The rain lessened from a roar to a patter. The wind died down to a whisper. Slowly, so slowly, the world began to quiet. When I finally found the courage to stand up, my legs were shaking so bad I could barely walk. I turned on my phone's flashlight and looked around. The store was a disaster zone. Everything was wet, broken, or both. The front of the store was open to the elements, the door and windows completely gone. I made my way to where the door used to be and looked outside. The world looked different, like an alien landscape. Trees were down everywhere. The gas pumps were on their sides. Cars in the parking lot had been tossed around like toys. As I stood there, staring at the destruction, the first rays of dawn began to break through the clouds. The storm was over. But standing there in the wreckage of the gas station, I knew I'd never forget that night. The night when a routine shift turned into a fight for survival against the fury of nature. The night shift at the Emerald View Hotel in downtown Seattle is usually pretty quiet. Most guests are asleep, and I'm just there to handle any late check-ins or minor issues that pop up. But this one night, everything changed in a way I never expected. I was at the front desk, scrolling through my phone and occasionally glancing at the security monitors. It was a slow night, even for the graveyard shift. The lobby was empty, just the soft hum of the air conditioning and the muted sounds of late-night traffic outside. The call came in around 2 a.m. The phone's ring cut through the silence, making me jump a little. It was a guest from room 412, complaining about loud noises coming from the room next door. His voice was groggy but annoyed, saying he'd been woken up by what sounded like shouting and things being thrown around. At first, I thought it was just a typical noise complaint. Maybe someone had too much to drink or was watching TV too loud. I told the guest I'd check it out right away, hoping it would be a quick and easy fix. As I walked towards the elevator, I couldn't shake this weird feeling in my gut. Something about the way the guest described the noises didn't sit right with me. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt longer than usual, and with each passing floor, my unease grew. Stepping out onto the 4th floor, the hallway was dimly lit and eerily quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the ice machine at the far end, but as I walked towards room 414, I started to hear something else. At first, it was just muffled sounds, but as I got closer, I could make out angry voices. Standing outside the door, I could clearly hear a man's voice, low and threatening. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill through me. There was a thud, like something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a woman's muffled cry. My hand hovered over the door, hesitating for a moment before I knocked. The voices inside immediately went quiet. I waited, my heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. Seconds ticked by, feeling like hours. Finally, the door opened, just a crack at first. A man's face appeared, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He reeked of alcohol, and his breath came in short, angry puffs. He glared at me, not saying a word, just waiting for me to speak. I managed to ask if everything was okay, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's face twisted into a forced smile, all teeth and no warmth. He said everything was fine, just a little argument, nothing to worry about. But his eyes told a different story. They were darting around, never meeting mine, like he was hiding something. That's when I saw her. Just for a moment, as the man shifted his stance, I caught a glimpse of a woman behind him. She was huddled in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. Even from that brief look, I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she seemed to shrink into herself. Before I could say anything else, the man's demeanor changed. His fake smile dropped, replaced by a scowl. He told me to mind my own business and slammed the door in my face. The sound echoed down the empty hallway, making me flinch. I stood there for a moment, frozen. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. That woman's face, her terrified expression, it was burned into my memory. I knew I couldn't just walk away and pretend everything was fine. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and called the police. I tried to keep my voice low as I explained the situation, worried that the man might hear me through the door. The dispatcher assured me they'd send someone right away, but those minutes waiting felt like an eternity. I went back down to the lobby to wait for the police, my eyes glued to the security monitors. I was terrified I'd see the couple trying to leave, but the hallways remained empty. When 2 officers finally arrived, I felt a mix of relief and dread. We went back up to the 4th floor together, the officer's presence giving me a small sense of security. But as we approached room 414, that feeling quickly evaporated. The hallway was silent. No voices, no sounds of movement, nothing. One of the officers knocked on the door, announcing their presence. No response. They knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. After a brief discussion, they decided to use the master key I'd brought. As the door swung open, my stomach dropped. The room was empty. The bed was unmade, clothes were strewn about, and a lamp lay broken on the floor, but the couple was gone. Somehow, in the short time it took for the police to arrive, they had managed to slip away unnoticed. The officers did a quick search of the room, looking for any clues or signs of where the couple might have gone. I couldn't stop staring at that corner where I'd seen the woman. There was nothing there now, just an empty space that seemed to mock me. We checked the security footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of them leaving, but somehow they'd managed to avoid all the cameras. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. The officers took my statement and said they'd file a report, but I could tell by their expressions that they didn't have much hope of finding the couple. As the police left and I returned to my post at the front desk, I couldn't shake the image of that woman's face from my mind. The fear in her eyes, the way she'd huddled in that corner, it haunted me. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if there was something more I could have done, if I should have acted sooner. I've been working the night shift at Sunshine Supermarket for about 6 months now. It's a pretty big store in a strip mall just outside Tampa. Most nights, it's just me and one other person restocking shelves and getting everything ready for the morning rush. It's usually quiet, boring even. But this one night, man, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was the middle of summer, and even at night, the Florida heat was brutal. The store's air conditioning was working overtime, and I could hear it humming as I worked in the back room, unpacking boxes of cereal and canned goods. My coworker had called in sick, so I was on my own that night. I didn't mind, though. I kinda liked the solitude, just me and my thoughts as I went through the motions of my job. I was deep in the storage area, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes and the faint smell of cleaning products, when I heard it. A loud crash echoed through the store, followed by the tinkling sound of breaking glass. At first, I thought maybe a shelf had collapsed or something. It's happened before, especially with the heavier items. But then I heard another crash, and another. This wasn't an accident. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but I realized I'd left it charging in the break room. Stupid, I know. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to decide what to do. The crashing sounds continued, punctuated by what sounded like laughter. It was high-pitched and erratic, not like normal laughter at all. I knew I had to see what was going on. Maybe it was just some kids messing around and I could scare them off. I grabbed a broom, not much of a weapon, but it made me feel a little better, and slowly made my way out of the storage area. As I approached the swinging doors that led to the main store, the sounds got louder. I could hear shelves being knocked over, more glass breaking, and that weird laughter. I pushed the door open just a crack and peeked out. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a kid, Couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, standing in the middle of the cereal aisle. But this wasn't just some punk looking to cause trouble. The kid was shirtless, covered in sweat, and his eyes were wide and unfocused, darting around like he was seeing things that weren't there. He was grabbing boxes of cereal and smashing them on the ground, then stomping on them, all while making these weird grunting noises. As I watched, he picked up a glass jar of pasta sauce and hurled it at one of the security cameras. His aim was way off, and the jar exploded against a shelf, sending red sauce and glass shards everywhere. I knew right away this kid was on something. Maybe bath salts or flakka. We'd had some problems with those in the area lately. Whatever it was, it had turned this skinny teenager into an unpredictable, violent mess. I must have made a noise or something because suddenly, the kid's head snapped in my direction. For a second, we just stared at each other. I saw confusion in his eyes, then anger. He let out this animal-like growl and started running towards me. I didn't even think. I just slammed the door shut and ran back into the storage area. I could hear him pounding on the door, screaming incoherently. The door was pretty solid, but I didn't know how long it would hold. I ran through the maze of shelves and boxes, my mind racing. I needed to call for help, but my phone was still in the break room. The only other phone was in the manager's office, clear on the other side of the store. I'd have to go back out there to reach it. The banging on the door stopped, but I could hear crashing sounds from the store again. I took a deep breath and peered out. The kid was back in the aisles, this time in the liquor section. He was grabbing bottles and smashing them on the floor, laughing that crazy laugh again. I knew this was my chance. I slipped out of the storage area and hugged the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The store seemed huge now, the distance to the office like a mile-long gauntlet. I could see the trail of destruction the kid had left. Broken jars, smashed boxes, puddles of various liquids all over the floor. I was about halfway to the office when my foot slipped on some spilled olive oil. I managed to catch myself, but I knocked over a display of chips. The noise was like a gunshot in the quiet store. The kid's head whipped around, and those wild eyes locked onto me. He let out another inhuman scream and started running in my direction, a broken bottle in his hand. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I could hear him behind me, screaming and laughing. I reached the office door, fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the right one in the lock. I practically fell into the office, slamming the door behind me just as the kid reached it. He started pounding on the door, screaming and swearing. I could see his distorted face through the small window in the door, his eyes bulging, spit flying from his mouth as he yelled. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my fingers slipping on the buttons. When the operator answered, I was talking so fast I'm not sure if she understood everything I was saying. I told her about the kid, about how he was destroying the store, how he was clearly on something and violent. She told me to stay put, that officers were on their way. But those minutes waiting in that office, they were the longest of my life. The kid kept pounding on the door, throwing his body against it. I was sure any second the lock would give way and he'd be in here with me. I could hear things breaking in the store, punctuated by that insane laughter. At one point, there was a loud crash followed by the sound of rushing water. I realized he must have broken one of the big tanks in the pet section where we keep the live fish. I don't know how long I was in there. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 15 minutes. Suddenly, I heard sirens in the distance. The kid must have heard them too because the pounding on the door stopped. The next few minutes were a blur. I heard car doors slamming, voices shouting. There was a scuffle, more yelling, and then silence. A knock on the office door made me jump. A police officer's voice called out, asking if I was okay. I opened the door, my legs feeling like jelly. The scene in the store was like something out of a disaster movie. Broken glass and merchandise everywhere. Puddles of water, soda, and booze all over the floor. And the smell. A mixture of food, alcohol, and something else I couldn't identify. I was working the night shift at this call center in Phoenix. It's one of those big corporate buildings, you know. All glass and steel, looks impressive during the day, but at night it's just this dark, hulking shape against the sky. Inside, it's a different story. Rows and rows of cubicles, the glow of computer screens, and the constant hum of air conditioning. I'd been there for about 6 months, mostly handling customer service calls for a big tech company. Night shift was usually pretty quiet. A few calls here and there, mostly from people in different time zones or night owls with tech problems. I didn't mind it. The pay was decent, and I could listen to music between calls. That night started like any other. I clocked in, grabbed a coffee from the break room, and settled into my cubicle. The first few hours were typical. A guy who couldn't figure out how to reset his password, a woman whose laptop wouldn't connect to Wi-Fi. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was around 2 a.m. when that call came in. I remember glancing at the clock on my computer screen just before I hit the button to accept it. The line crackled to life, and I launched into my usual greeting. At first, there was just silence. This happens sometimes. People misdial or their connection is bad. I was about to repeat my greeting when I heard it. A shaky breath, followed by a man's voice. He sounded off. Not angry or upset like some callers, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He started talking, his words coming out in a rush. He wasn't calling about tech support. He was calling because he said he needed someone to talk to, that he couldn't take it anymore. I tried to interject to tell him he'd reached the wrong department, but then he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned he had a gun. My training kicked in immediately. We had protocols for this kind of situation, though I never thought I'd actually need to use them. I kept my voice calm, even as my hand shook, reaching for the button that would silently alert my supervisor. I asked him his name, trying to establish a connection. He didn't give it, but he kept talking. About his job, his family, how everything had fallen apart. I listened, making small sounds of acknowledgement, trying to keep him engaged. All the while, my eyes were darting around looking for my supervisor, wondering if help was on the way. The minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. I was hyper-aware of every sound on the other end of the line. The man's ragged breathing, the occasional clink that might have been the gun. My palms were sweating, making it hard to grip my headset. I tried to steer the conversation towards positive topics, anything to keep his mind off what he was contemplating. I asked about his family, his hobbies, anything to humanize him, to remind him of his connections to the world. Sometimes he'd go quiet, and those silences were the worst. I'd feel my heart pounding, wondering if this was it, if I'd lost him. At one point, he started talking about his kids. His voice cracked, and I thought I heard him crying. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that things would get better, but the words felt hollow. What did I know? I was just some random person on the other end of a phone line. I kept glancing at the clock, shocked to see that nearly an hour had passed. My throat was dry from talking, and my head was pounding from the stress. But I couldn't let any of that show in my voice. As far as this man knew, I was calm, collected, there just for him. Then came a moment that nearly broke me. He said he was sorry for bothering me, that he should just get it over with. I heard a sound that might have been him cocking the gun. My mouth went dry, and for a second I couldn't speak. In that moment, I realized the full weight of the situation. My words, my actions, could literally be the difference between life and death for this stranger. I managed to find my voice, telling him he wasn't bothering me, that I wanted to talk to him. I asked him more about his kids, what they were like, their names, anything to pull his focus back. He started talking again, haltingly at first, then with more animation. I felt a glimmer of hope. As we talked, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. My supervisor was there, nodding at me, giving me a thumbs up. I didn't know what it meant. Had they contacted the police? Traced the call? I couldn't ask. Couldn't break the flow of conversation with the man. The next half hour was a blur. I talked about everything and nothing. My own family, my dog, a funny thing that happened at the grocery store. Anything to keep him engaged, to build a connection. All the while my mind was racing, wondering what was happening on his end, if help was on the way. Then suddenly, I heard noises in the background of his call. Muffled voices. Movement. The man's voice changed, became alarmed. He said something about people being there. Then the line went dead. I sat there, my hand still gripping the headset, staring at the screen that showed the call had ended. The cubicle felt too small, too quiet after the intensity of the past hour and a half. My supervisor was there, asking if I was okay, but I barely heard him. I don't know what happened after that call. I don't know if the man is okay, if the police got there in time, if he changed his mind. All I know is that for those 90 minutes, I was the only thing standing between a stranger and the darkest moment of his life. And I've never felt anything quite like that before or since. I work nights at this 24-hour gym in Los Angeles. It's one of those places that never sleeps, you know? Always someone working out, no matter the hour. My shift starts at 11 p.m., and I'm usually there until 7 a.m. It's not a bad gig, mostly quiet, just keeping an eye on things, wiping down equipment and helping the occasional night owl with a question or two. This particular night started like any other. I clocked in, did a quick walkthrough of the gym floor, and settled in behind the front desk. The place was pretty empty. Just a few regulars I recognized. There was this older guy on the treadmill, been coming in for a few weeks now. Always polite, always focused on his workout. And then there was this younger woman lifting weights in the corner. They were the only two in the gym at that point. I was scrolling through my phone, half paying attention to the security cameras when I heard it. A thud, followed by the whirring sound of a treadmill running without anyone on it. I looked up at the monitors and saw the older guy sprawled out on the floor behind the treadmill. For a second, I just froze. You know that moment when your brain is trying to process what you're seeing? But then instinct kicked in and I was on my feet, sprinting across the gym floor. As I got closer, I could see he wasn't moving. The treadmill was still going, making this eerie humming sound in the quiet gym. I reached him and hit the emergency stop on the treadmill. Up close, I could see his face was turning this weird grayish color. His eyes were open, but there was no response when I called out to him. I dropped down beside him, my knees hitting the rubber floor mat hard. I put my hand on his chest, trying to feel for any movement. Nothing. My mind was racing, trying to remember all those first aid courses they made us take. I yelled out to the woman who was lifting weights, asking her to call 911. She looked shocked, but nodded and ran for her phone. I tilted the guy's head back, checked his airway, and started chest compressions. You know how in movies they make CPR look so easy? It's not. It's exhausting and scary as hell when you're doing it for real. I could feel his ribs shifting under my hands, and for a split second I worried I was pushing too hard. But then I remembered the instructor saying, "It's better to break a rib than let someone die." I don't know how long I was doing compressions before the woman came over. She was on the phone with 911 relaying information to me. They wanted to know if we had an AED in the gym. We did, but it was all the way by the front desk. I couldn't stop compressions, so I had to talk the woman through where to find it and how to bring it over. Time gets weird in situations like that. Every second feels like an hour, but at the same time, everything's happening so fast. I was counting compressions in my head, trying to keep a steady rhythm. Sweat was dripping down my face, stinging my eyes. My arms were starting to burn, but I couldn't stop. The woman came back with the AED. Her hands were shaking as she opened it up. The machine started talking, giving instructions. We had to stop compressions to let it analyze the guy's heart rhythm. Those few seconds of just waiting, watching the flashing lights on the AED, were agonizing. The machine advised a shock. We had to make sure we weren't touching the guy. I remember the sound of the AED charging up, this high-pitched whine that seemed to go on forever. Then the shock. The guy's body jerked, and for a split second I thought it had worked. But the AED was already telling us to resume CPR. Back to compressions. My arms felt like lead, but I kept going. The woman was kneeling on the other side of the guy, looking terrified. I tried to reassure her, but I'm not sure anything I said made sense. I was so focused on keeping count, on maintaining the rhythm. I don't know how many cycles of CPR we went through. The AED shocked him 2 more times. Each time, that moment of hope followed by the crushing realization that it hadn't worked. The gym, which is usually filled with the sound of clanking weights and whirring machines, was eerily quiet, except for the sound of my ragged breathing and the AED's robotic voice. I kept glancing at the gym's entrance, willing the paramedics to appear. Every second felt crucial. I knew that the longer we went without getting his heart started, the worse his chances were. But I couldn't let myself think about that. I just had to keep going, keep pushing. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard sirens. The woman ran to prop open the gym door. I didn't stop compressions. I couldn't. It felt like if I stopped, even for a second, I'd be giving up on this guy. The paramedics rushed in with their equipment. One of them took over compressions while another started setting up more advanced equipment. They were asking questions rapid fire. How long had he been down? How many shocks? Any known medical history? I answered as best I could, my breath coming in gasps. As they worked, I stumbled back, my legs feeling like jelly. I watched as they intubated him, attached monitors, administered drugs. It was like watching a well-choreographed dance, each paramedic knowing exactly what to do. They shocked him again with their more powerful defibrillator. This time, something changed. One of the paramedics called out that they had a pulse, a weak one, but it was there. They quickly got him on a stretcher and started moving towards the exit. As they wheeled him out, I caught a glimpse of his face. The gray color was gone, replaced by a hint of pink. His eyes were closed now. The last thing I saw was them loading him into the ambulance, the lights casting a red glow across the empty parking lot. Then they were gone, sirens fading into the distance. I turned back to the gym. The treadmill was still there, silent now, a stark reminder of how quickly things can change. The floor was a mess of discarded AED pads, wrappers from the paramedics' equipment, and a pool of sweat where I'd been kneeling. I work as a night security guard at this mall in Ohio. It's one of those big ones, you know? 2 floors, tons of stores, a food court, the works. My shift starts when everyone else is heading home. The mall closes at 9, but I don't clock in until 11. That gives the cleaning crew time to do their thing without me getting in their way. So there I was, starting my usual rounds. The mall's different at night. During the day, it's all noise and people. At night, it's just empty. My footsteps echo off the walls, and the only other sound is the hum of the air conditioning. The storefronts are all dark, mannequins in the windows looking like ghosts in the dim emergency lighting. I'd been working there for about 6 months, so I had my routine down. Start at the north entrance, work my way through the first floor, then up to the second. Check all the service corridors, make sure all the doors are locked. It's boring work, but it pays the bills. I was about halfway through my first round when I heard it. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It was just a faint sound, like something scraping against metal. I paused, listening hard. There it was again. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, near the electronics store. Now I've dealt with all sorts of things in this job. Teenagers trying to sneak in after hours, homeless people looking for shelter, even a raccoon that got in through the loading dock once. But this felt different. I moved closer, trying to keep my steps quiet. The sound was definitely coming from the electronics store. As I got nearer, I could see something wasn't right. The security gate was pulled down, but it looked off, like it wasn't sitting quite right. My hand went to my radio, but I hesitated. I didn't want to call this in if it turned out to be nothing. False alarms don't look good on the report. So I crept closer, squinting in the low light. That's when I saw it. The bottom of the gate was bent upwards, just enough for someone to squeeze under. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some kids messing around. This was a break-in. I reached for my radio again, but then I saw movement inside the store. Just a shadow, really, but it was enough. Someone was in there. And if they were still inside, that meant I might have walked up right in the middle of the burglary. I backed away as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd be able to hear it. Once I was around the corner, I pulled out my radio and called it in. The dispatcher said they'd send officers right away, but it'd take them at least 10 minutes to get there. 10 minutes. It might as well have been 10 hours. What was I supposed to do for 10 minutes? That's when I heard voices. More than one. They were muffled, but they were definitely coming from the electronics store. This wasn't just one burglar. There were multiple people in there. I knew I should just stay put and wait for the police. That's what they tell you in training. Don't be a hero. But what if they finished up and left before the cops got there? I had to at least try to keep an eye on them, right? So I did probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I decided to get closer, to see if I could figure out how many there were, maybe get a description for the police. I crept back towards the store, staying low. The voices were clearer now. I could make out at least 3 distinct voices, all male. They were arguing about something, but I couldn't make out the words. I was so focused on listening that I almost missed it when one of them started coming out. I barely had time to duck behind a potted plant before a guy squeezed under the gate. He was tall, wearing all black, with a backpack that looked stuffed full. I held my breath as he looked around, praying he wouldn't see me. After what felt like forever, he turned and headed towards the north exit. As soon as he was out of sight, I let out a shaky breath. But I wasn't in the clear. There were still at least 2 more inside, and now I was stuck. If I moved, they might hear me. If I stayed, they might see me when they came out. I heard more movement from the store. They were getting ready to leave. I had to make a decision. Stay put and risk being seen, or try to find a better hiding spot. I decided to move. As quietly as I could, I crawled towards a nearby kiosk. It wasn't great cover, but it was better than the plant. I had just made it when I heard the scrape of the gate again. 2 more guys came out, both carrying bags. They were talking in low voices, something about a clean getaway. I was trying so hard not to move, not to breathe, that I felt like I was going to pass out. They started walking, heading in the same direction as the first guy. I thought I was in the clear, but then one of them stopped. He was looking around like he had heard something. I was sure he was going to spot me. I could see him clearly in the dim light, his face half hidden by a baseball cap. He took a step in my direction, and I thought for sure it was over. Then, from outside, came the sound of sirens. The guy's head snapped towards the sound, and without a word, he and his buddy took off running. I stayed hidden, my whole body shaking, as I heard the sound of running footsteps fade away. The sirens were getting louder. I wanted to stand up to run towards the entrance and wave the police in, but I couldn't make myself move. It wasn't until I heard the sound of the police radios inside the mall that I finally managed to get to my feet. My legs felt like jelly as I walked towards the sound. I rounded a corner, and there they were. 4 officers, guns drawn, looking alert. When they saw me, they started shouting, telling me to put my hands up. I did, explaining as fast as I could that I was the security guard, that I was the one who had called it in. They lowered their weapons, and that's when it really hit me. What had just happened? What could have happened? One of the officers was asking me questions, but I was having trouble focusing. All I could think about was how close those guys had been, how easily they could have seen me. The police swept the building, but of course the burglars were long gone. They took my statement, asked me to show them where I'd seen the men, what direction they went. I answered as best I could, but it all felt surreal, like I was talking about something that had happened to someone else. I worked the night shift at this small motel just off I-75 in Georgia. It's one of those places you see when you're driving long distance and need a cheap place to crash for the night. Nothing fancy, just a single-story building with about 20 rooms, a vending machine, and a small office where I spend most of my nights. My shift starts at 10 p.m. and goes until 6 a.m. Most nights, it's pretty quiet. I check in a few late arrivals, maybe deal with a noise complaint or two, but mostly I just watch old movies on the small TV behind the desk to pass the time. This particular night started out like any other. I came in, got the rundown from the evening shift guy, and settled in for what I thought would be another uneventful night. The motel was about half full, mostly truckers and a few families on road trips. It was around 2 a.m. when things started to go sideways. The office phone rang, which was unusual for that time of night. I picked it up, expecting it to be a guest complaining about the Wi-Fi or something. Instead, I heard this woman's voice, all panicky and breathless. She was talking so fast I could barely understand her at first. Once I got her to slow down, she told me someone was trying to break into her room, She said she could hear someone messing with the lock and rattling the doorknob. I asked for her room number and told her to stay calm, that I'd take care of it. I was about to call the police when the office door burst open. This guy came stumbling in, looking like he'd been through hell. His clothes were all messed up, his hair was wild, and he had this look in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He came right up to the desk, leaning over it, getting way too close for comfort. He started demanding to know which room his wife was in. He was practically spitting the words out, he was so worked up. That's when it clicked. This must be the guy the woman on the phone was scared of. I tried to play it cool, told him I couldn't give out guest information, but he wasn't having it. He started pounding on the desk, yelling that he knew she was here, that her car was in the parking lot. Now, I'm not a small guy, but this dude was built like a linebacker and looked like he could snap at any second. And here I was, all alone in this tiny office miles from the nearest town. We don't have any security at the motel. Most nights we don't need it. But right then, I was wishing we had a whole SWAT team on standby. I knew I had to keep this guy calm somehow, keep him from going to the rooms. If he started kicking down doors, things could get real bad, real fast. So I started talking, trying to distract him. I told him I'd need to see some ID before I could give out any information. It was a long shot, but I was hoping it might buy some time. He started digging through his pockets, cursing and muttering the whole time. While he was distracted, I tried to reach for the phone to call 911, but he saw me and slammed his hand down on the receiver. That's when he really started to lose it. He was screaming about how his wife was cheating on him, how he'd followed her here. He kept saying he was going to teach her a lesson. The way he said it made my blood run cold. I knew I had to keep him talking, keep him focused on me and not on finding that poor woman. So I started asking him questions, where he was from, how long he'd been married, anything I could think of to keep him engaged. It was like walking a tightrope. Every time I thought I was getting through to him, he'd remember why he was there and start getting agitated again. I'd have to quickly change the subject, find something else to talk about. All the while I was trying to figure out how to get help. The phone was out of reach and my cell was in my back pocket. There was no way I could get to it without him noticing. Time seemed to stretch out forever. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept expecting to hear screams from one of the rooms or for this guy to suddenly bolt out the door and start searching the motel himself. I was running out of things to talk about, and he was getting more and more impatient. He started pacing back and forth in front of the desk like a caged animal. I could see him eyeing the door that led to the rooms, and I knew I was losing him. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw the guy's head snap up. He heard it too. For a second we just stood there frozen. Then he made a break for the door. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I vaulted over the desk and grabbed him. We went down in a tangle of limbs, knocking over the little stand with all the tourist brochures. We wrestled on the floor, him trying to get to the door, me just trying to hold on. He was stronger than me, but I was desperate. I knew if he got out that door, he'd find that woman's room before the cops could get here. I don't know how long we struggled. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a minute or two. Then the office door burst open again, and suddenly, the room was full of cops. They pulled the guy off me, got him in cuffs. One of them helped me up, asked if I was okay. I was out of breath, my shirt was torn, and I knew I'd have some bruises. But I nodded. As they took the guy out to the patrol car, one of the officers explained that the woman had managed to call 911 from her room. They'd been on their way here when they got my location from dispatch. I watched as they put the guy in the back of a patrol car. He was still yelling, still trying to get to the rooms. I saw one of the officers talking to a woman. Must have been the one who called me. She looked shaken up, but okay. And just like that, it was over. The cops took my statement, made sure the woman was all right, and then they were gone. I was left standing in the office, surrounded by scattered brochures and the upended brochure stand, trying to process what had just happened. I work the night shift at this 24-hour laundromat in Baltimore. It's in one of those neighborhoods where you always keep your head on a swivel, you know? I've been doing this job for about a year now. Most nights, it's just me, the hum of the washing machines, and maybe a few night owls doing their laundry. This particular night started out slow. It was the middle of the week and the place was empty. I was just sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, trying to stay awake. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting this harsh glow over everything. Outside, the streets were quiet. You could hear the occasional car passing by, but that was about it. I remember looking at the clock at some point. It was around 2 a.m. That's usually when things start to wind down completely. Most people, even in this neighborhood, are asleep by then. I was thinking about maybe closing my eyes for a few minutes when I heard them coming. At first, it was just noise from outside, loud voices laughing, that kind of thing. I didn't think much of it at first. But then the door swung open and this group of teenagers came pouring in. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them, boys and girls. They were loud, pushing each other, knocking over the little baskets we keep for people to carry their clothes. Right away, I knew this wasn't going to be good. They weren't carrying any laundry, for one thing. And the way they were acting, all hyped up and rowdy, it was clear they were just looking for trouble. I sat up straighter behind the counter, keeping my eyes on them. They spread out across the laundromat, some of them jumping up to sit on the washing machines, others messing with the vending machines in the corner. One of them, a tall kid with a red hoodie, he kept looking over at me, this smirk on his face. I tried to ignore them at first, hoping they'd get bored and leave, but they just got louder and more disruptive. They were yelling to each other across the room using language that would make a sailor blush. One of them started kicking one of the dryers over and over. The sound echoed through the empty laundromat. That's when I knew I had to say something. I stood up from behind the counter and called out to them. I tried to keep my voice firm but calm. I told them they needed to leave if they weren't here to do laundry. As soon as the words left my mouth, I felt this shift in the air. It was like all their attention suddenly zeroed in on me. The kid in the red hoodie, he jumped down from the washing machine he was sitting on and started walking towards me. The others followed, forming this loose semicircle around the counter. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Red hoodie leaned on the counter, getting right in my face. He asked me what I was going to do if they didn't leave. His breath smelled like cigarettes and something stronger. The others were all watching, some of them laughing, others just staring at me with these cold eyes. I tried to stand my ground. I told them again that they needed to leave, that I'd call the cops if I had to. As soon as I mentioned the police, things escalated. Red Hoodie's face changed, his smirk turning into something uglier. He reached into his pocket, and that's when I saw it. The glint of what looked like a knife blade. He didn't pull it out all the way, just enough to make sure I saw it. The message was clear. My mouth went dry and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead. I glanced towards the phone on the counter, but it might as well have been a mile away. There was no way I could reach it without them seeing, and I knew that if I tried, things would get ugly fast. The others had spread out, effectively boxing me in behind the counter. There was no back door, no other way out. I was trapped, and they knew it. They started taunting me, asking if I was scared, if I was going to cry. One of the girls, she had this high, mocking laugh that set my teeth on edge. I tried to think of a way out of this. Maybe if I could just keep them talking, someone would come in. But at this time of night in this neighborhood, I knew that was a long shot. The streets outside were empty, and even if someone did walk by, would they really want to get involved? Red Hoodie started asking me questions. Where was I from? Did I have any money in the register? What time did I get off work? With each question, he leaned in closer. I could see the others watching, feeding off his energy. Some of them had started rifling through the lost and found box, tossing people's forgotten clothes around. I answered his questions as vaguely as I could, trying not to give away any personal information. All the while, I was acutely aware of that knife in his pocket. Every time he moved his hand, I flinched, sure that this was the moment he was going to pull it out. The minutes crawled by. It felt like hours. My legs were shaking, and I had to lean on the counter to keep myself upright. I kept thinking about my family, wondering if I'd see them again. Would they find me here in the morning? What would happen if I didn't show up for Thanksgiving dinner next week? One of the other guys, he started messing with the security camera in the corner. He was trying to turn it to face the wall. I wanted to tell him it didn't matter, that the camera was just for show and didn't actually record anything, but I kept my mouth shut. That camera, fake as it was, felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever these kids might do. Red Hoodie must have noticed me looking at the camera. He grabbed my chin, forcing me to look at him. He asked if I thought someone was going to come save me. His fingers dug into my skin and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. I tried to pull away, but he just gripped harder. That's when I heard it, the sound of a siren in the distance. It wasn't close, probably not even on our street, but it was enough. Red Hoodie let go of my face and took a step back. The others stopped what they were doing, suddenly alert. For a moment, no one moved. Then Red Hoodie nodded to the others. They started heading for the door, knocking over chairs and baskets as they went. Red Hoodie was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway for a second, just staring at me. Then he spit on the floor and walked out. I stood there, frozen, listening to their voices fade as they moved down the street. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to grab onto the counter to keep from collapsing. The laundromat was a mess. Clothes strewn everywhere, chairs overturned, but all I could think about was how close I'd come to. I didn't even want to think about what could have happened. It took me a few minutes to realize the siren had faded away. It probably hadn't even been coming to the laundromat. Just a coincidence. But that coincidence might have saved my life. I looked at the clock. Only 20 minutes had passed since they first came in. 20 minutes that felt like a lifetime. I could still smell the alcohol and cigarette smoke in the air. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone to call my manager. As I dialed the number, I kept my eyes on the door, half expecting them to come back at any moment. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.